All right, are we? Oh, good. All right, that's working here. So as Ryan mentioned, I live in southwestern Pennsylvania, but I'm actually from southeastern Pennsylvania. I went to Radnor High School about 10 minutes from here. In fact, I have my 40th reunion tomorrow night. I'm really looking forward to that. And I went to graduate school here, and then I lived in Chester County for 10 years, but I have been in the Pittsburgh area for the last 12 years. So I just want to, Joelle mentioned something. Wawa is far better than Sheetz. There is absolutely no question about that. But thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am feeling even more upbeat about the U.S. economy now than I was a few weeks ago for a few reasons. One is our small business survey. So PNC does a small business survey semi-annually, national sample. This is not just PNC clients. And we had some of the strongest results in the 20-plus year history of the survey for the fall of 2024. Small business owners, this is optimism about their own company's prospects. The share that is pessimistic, less than 1%. The small business owners are feeling very optimistic about their local economy, about the national economy, about the global economy. So they are feeling very good about conditions, and this is true for manufacturers, but it's also true for service industries, retail, and so forth. So small business optimism is very, very strong right now. And we started to see the Federal Reserve ease monetary policy. So when the pandemic hit in early 2020, the Fed wanted to support economic growth, so they cut interest rates. The Fed funds rate, that's their key short-term policy rate, they pushed that down to 0. Short-term interest rates, the yield on the 3-month Treasury bill, the blue line, basically down to 0. And the Fed also worked to reduce long-term interest rates as well. So you see the yield on the 10-year Treasury note fell below 1%. But then inflation started to pick up. The economy began to recover. The Fed was concerned that the economy was overheating, so they aggressively raised interest rates. That Fed funds rate started out, in early 2022, it was basically 0. By mid-2023, it was between 5.25%, 5.5%, and it stayed at that level up until September 18th, when the Fed cut that Fed funds rate by 0.5 percentage point. So it has come down, and we expect that there will be further interest rate cuts coming forward. So we expect the Federal Open Market Committee to cut the Fed funds rate by 0.25 percentage point in November, 0.25 percentage point in December, and then 4 more times in 2025, which would take it down to around 3.25%, 3.5% by the middle of next year. So those lower interest rates will encourage consumer and business borrowing and support economic growth. And investors are feeling good right now. So we've been hitting record stock prices in recent weeks. The blue bar is the S&P 500, very broad-based measure of stock prices in the United States. This reflects investors' expectations for the U.S. economy, but in particular corporate profits over the next few months, next few years. And what you can see is that we saw a big drop in stock prices with the pandemic, but then as the economy started to recover, we had record high stock prices in 2021. Then we had high inflation, the Fed raising rates, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so we saw stock prices fall in 2022, but as the economy remained strong, as inflation started to slow, more recently as we've seen the Fed cutting rates, we've seen stock prices pick back up again, and we are at record highs in the stock market. And similarly, the orange line, the VIX index, that's a measure of volatility, how much stock prices are moving up and down. You can see that enormous spike in volatility with the pandemic. Was still high in 2021, 2022. We were dealing with a lot of issues, but has settled down more recently. And again, this reflects investor optimism about the U.S. economy over the next few years. And then the labor market remains very, very good. I saw the news this morning. The unemployment rate in Pennsylvania is 3.4%. Incredibly low, historically low. You can see the national unemployment there, the orange line on the right-hand scale, was 3.5% before the pandemic. got up to almost 15% in April of 2020 when things were at their worst, but hit 3.4% last year for a couple of months. That's the lowest unemployment rate we've had in more than 50 years. Now, it's up a little bit. It got up to 4.3% in July, back down to 4.1% in September, but historically low unemployment. And if you look at the number of jobs in the U.S. economy, the blue line on the left-hand scale, you can see that we lost 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. Compare that to the Great Recession, which was a very bad downturn, where we lost about 8 million jobs over 2 years, so much larger job losses in a much shorter period of time. But now we are basically back on trend. If you continue that line from before the pandemic straight through, we've added about 8 million jobs, about 5% higher unemployment now than we had before the pandemic. Remarkable recovery. And it's not just the labor market, it's the overall economy. So this is 3 measures of economic activity. These are adjusted for inflation, so these are not higher prices, these are higher volumes. And I set the fourth quarter of 2019, right before the pandemic, equal to 100. We've got GDP, output of goods and services, final sales of domestic product, which is GDP minus inventories, measures demand in the U.S. economy. And then finally, the orange line is gross domestic income. That's an alternative measure of the size of the economy. It looks at the income going to households and businesses from economic activity. It excludes government transfer payments, and that's going to become important in a minute. But what you can see is, basically by any of these measures, the economy contracted, 8, 9% over 2 quarters in the first half of 2020 with the pandemic. And again, compare that to the Great Recession, where we saw the economy contract by about 4% over 6 quarters. So much steeper contraction, much shorter period of time. But look where we are now. Our economy is 10% larger than it was before the pandemic. Remarkable recovery. If you look at other G7 economies, we are blowing them out of the water. Much stronger recovery in the United States than we've had globally. And we continue to see solid growth through the first half of 2024, and it looks like the third quarter of 2024 is going to be very solid as well. Now, that being said, we have seen big shifts in the economy since the pandemic. So again, these numbers are adjusted for inflation. I set the fourth quarter of 2019 equal to 100. So consumer spending on services, the blue line, education, healthcare, housing, travel and tourism, personal financial services, and so forth, you can see that that fell by about 15% with the pandemic. We weren't going to the doctor for discretionary visits, we weren't going on vacation, we weren't going out to eat. But it's recovered since then as the economy reopened and is now about 10% higher than it was before the pandemic. On the other hand, look at consumer spending on goods. These are either big-ticket items, cars and appliances, or non-durable goods, food, clothing, medications that are manufactured in the Philadelphia area. You can see that that demand surged with the pandemic. We were all stuck at home. We were all ordering stuff on Amazon, right? And so things were showing up at our doorstep. And by about a year or so after the pandemic started, goods spending was 15, 20% higher than it was before the pandemic. And this helps explain a lot of the issues that we saw in our economy in 2021, 2022. High inflation. Our economy wasn't set up to handle this level of good demand. Supply chain difficulties that I'm sure that many of you were experiencing. But what you can also see is that things have settled down, that consumer spending on goods has basically been flat since early 2021. There are only so many goods that you can buy, at least that's what I tell my kids. But after you buy a car, all the Pelotons that people bought, you don't need to buy them again for a while. So we've seen goods demand stabilize. Business fixed investment, and this is many of the products that you manufacture. Capital goods, equipment, machinery, information technology goods. Commercial construction also includes things like software and R&D. That fell by about 10% initially with the pandemic. But as the economy recovered, we had low interest rates. Many of you, I'm sure, had difficulty hiring, so what do? You invest in technologies that make your existing workers more productive. And so we see that business fixed investment now is about 17, 18% higher than it was before the pandemic. Residential investment, the black line, single and multifamily home building, so building materials are included in this category, repairs and renovations. We were all stuck at home, right? We were at home, our spouses were at home, our kids were at home, we were all cranky, we needed a bigger house and we needed to put an addition on. Mortgage rates were very low, so there was this surge in residential activity, but as mortgage rates increased, and again, once you do those types of repairs or new home building, you don't need to do it as much later, you can see that that fell. And by early 2023, it was a few percent below where it had been before the pandemic. But as mortgage rates have stabilized, have started to come down, we've seen a modest recovery there. Government, the purple line. So this is not government spending on transfer programs. So this doesn't include things like Social Security or Medicare. What it is government investment in the economy, government salaries, and so forth. So local, state, federal, so this is investment in infrastructure, federal defense spending that I'm sure that many of you here benefit from. And what you can see is there really wasn't much of a change from the pandemic through 2022. But then as the CHIPS Act started to kick in, as the infrastructure bill started to kick in, as the Inflation Reduction Act started to kick in, we saw a big increase in government spending, and that is supporting growth in the manufacturing sector. And then finally, this red line is the key to the entire thing, after-tax personal income. This is the income going to households and businesses from the labor market, from investment returns, small business profits, and government transfer payments. And now remember, I showed that chart. We lost 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. And yet household income jumped 10% after adjusting for inflation. Why? Because the federal government stepped in and provided aid to small business owners through the Paycheck Protection Program, provided extra unemployment benefits, provided stimulus payments to households. And then we saw another big increase in early 2021 with additional stimulus payments. But then those payments expired, inflation was high, so household income fell. But more recently, since early 2022, with strong job growth, wage growth now is running faster than inflation, household incomes are rising, adjusted for inflation. If households have more income, then they have more money to spend. Consumer spending makes up 2/3 of the U.S. economy, so that's supporting the economic expansion that we are seeing in the U.S. economy. In terms of inflation and supply chains, this is the New York Fed's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. So this looks at things like shipping costs and shipping times and purchasing manager surveys and so forth. You guys, I'm sure, know this a heck of a lot better than I do. Long-run value is set equal to 0. We had unprecedented supply chain issues in 2021, 2022 with the recovery from the pandemic, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and so forth. But the good news is that things are basically back to normal. And that has big implications for the inflation outlook. So this is various types of consumer inflation in the U.S. economy, the percent change from a year ago. Let's focus first on the green line, energy inflation, gasoline, home heating, electricity, and so forth. Following the recovery from the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had energy prices that were up 40% from a year earlier. But things have settled down, and now you can see that prices are a little bit lower than they were a couple of years ago. Still much higher than they were before the pandemic, but we've seen a stabilization in energy prices, and if anything, energy prices are down a little bit over the past year. Food and beverage inflation, the black line. Every time I went to the grocery store in 2022, 2023, it seems like it was a few bucks more than it had been. But you can see that things have settled down there and we're basically back to the pre-pandemic trend. Inflation in the low single digits. Core goods, goods excluding food and energy goods. So these are, for those of you who are in the consumer sector, these are the consumer goods that you manufacture. very high inflation in 2021, 2022 with all of those supply chain issues. But now we see that goods prices are down slightly over the last year or so. Again, higher than they were before the pandemic, but the prices aren't going up anymore. But for the Federal Reserve, the concern is the blue line, core services, services excluding food and energy, education, healthcare, housing, and so forth. You can see that the acceleration there was later. When we look at the other three components, that was like a 2021, 2022 story. On the services side, it's more of a 2023 story. And the Fed is concerned that this high core services inflation could get embedded in the U.S. economy. Now, we are starting to see that ease, particularly in the housing market. We do expect to see a further significant slowing in housing inflation going forward. And that has given the Fed the confidence they need to cut the federal funds rate. And again, they will continue to cut that Fed funds rate going forward as inflation continues to slow. And what they were most concerned about was overheating in the labor market. So the blue line on the left-hand scale is the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure. They want to see inflation at 2%. Basically, prices going up about 2% a year. You can see that we were well above that with the pandemic. And a lot of that is wage-driven, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing. So the orange line on the right-hand scale is wage growth in the U.S. economy. And you can see we had some spikes associated with the pandemic, a loss of low-wage jobs in early 2020. But then by 2022, when the labor market was so tight, when all of you were out there competing for workers, we had wage growth running around 6% a year, highest wage inflation in decades. But as the job market has settled down, we've seen wage growth slow. It's now around 4% a year. It needs to be somewhat closer to 3.5% a year to be consistent with that 2% inflation goal of the Fed, but we continue to move toward that. I'm feeling pretty optimistic about consumer spending, and in fact, a little more optimistic than I was a month or so ago. So this is going to get a little wonky, but bear with me on this. So if you look at the blue line on the left-hand scale, that's the personal savings rate, the share of after-tax income that households are saving. And you can see, first of all, heading into the Great Recession back in 2007, it was very low. It was around 3%. Households weren't saving enough, okay, and that was a big problem. All right. Now, heading into the pandemic, it was much higher. And then obviously it went up with the pandemic. We were stuck at home. We got money from the government. We couldn't spend it on anything. And so we saved a lot. But we have been spending down some of that savings. Now, a month or so ago, the government was reporting that the savings rate was about 3%. But then they announced that they had missed some income. The headline I saw was BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, finds income under couch cushions. And the household income is larger than we thought it was. And so that means that the savings rate, instead of being 3%, was 5%. So households are saving a bit more than I thought they were, which means they really don't need to do as much work to increase their savings. So that makes me feel more confident that households can continue to increase their spending going forward. And then how many of you have heard the stories about consumer debt, consumer credit card debt being at a record high? Okay, I get asked about this all the time. You know what else is at a record high? Jobs, incomes, GDP, wages, all of that kind of stuff. So when you look at household debt payments as a share of after-tax income, the orange line on the right-hand scale, that's actually historically low. It's not as low as it was a couple of years ago when we had aid from the government and debt moratoriums, student loan debt moratoriums and so forth. But when you look at consumer debts relative to incomes, lower than they were before the pandemic, much lower than they were heading into the Great Recession. Now, we are starting to see some signs of distress among lower and middle income consumers, but generally looking pretty solid there. And so households will be able to increase their spending going forward as long as the labor market remains strong. And I do think that the labor market will remain strong. This is the labor force participation rate, the share of adults who are working or looking for work. You can see the long-run decline with the pandemic, And then, with the retirement of the baby boomers from 2000 through 2020, fell very sharply with the pandemic as you had people who dropped out of the labor force because their kids were being schooled at home and their child care center was closed. They were concerned about catching the coronavirus. It's come back, but it's still below its pre-pandemic level. It is still a tight labor market out there. And we see that with businesses. The blue line on the left-hand scale is the layoff rate. It's the share of layoffs in the U.S. economy. You can see that it's much lower than it was heading into the pandemic. Many of you, I am sure, got caught in 2021, 2022 with too few workers. And so given that experience, businesses have been very, very reluctant to lay workers off. Now, we're not hiring as much as we were. The orange line on the right-hand scale is the hiring rate in the U.S. economy, and that has slowed, but we continue to see solid job growth. And in fact, the economy added more than 250,000 jobs in September. Over the past 3 months, we've added about 180,000 jobs on average. That's actually a little bit above the economy's long-term trend. And so the labor market continues to look solid and business layoffs remain low. We're also seeing some improvement in the housing market as mortgage rates, the blue line on the left-hand scale, have come down. They're down by about a percentage point over the past 6 months or so. You can see, housing, existing home sales still a little bit low, but I would expect as mortgage rates continue to move lower as the Fed eases, that we will see housing activity pick up. And we haven't been building enough houses. So this is housing starts in the U.S. economy. You can see before the Great Recession, we were putting up 1.25 million, 1.5 million homes a year. Over the last 15 years, we've been putting up 750,000 homes a year, 1 million homes a year. We just don't have enough housing in the U.S. economy, and so the need for more homes will support long-run economic growth. But there are some reasons for concern, and I'm going to try to do a little audio-visual demonstration, so let's see if this works out. So how many of you have heard about the inverted yield curve? Okay? So normally Ryan is a banker. So Ryan will tell you that when banks lend money for a longer period of time, they're taking on more risk. So normally we have short-term interest rates that are lower than long-term interest rates. Now, if you remember that chart that I showed you at the beginning, what it showed is that the yield on the 10-year Treasury note has gone up some, but the yield on the 3-month Treasury bill went up a lot. And so we now have short-term interest rates that are above long-term interest rates. These lines are below the axis. That's the inverted yield curve when we have short-term rates above long-term rates. And why do we care? Well, those gray bars in the U.S., in the graph here, those are recessions in the United States. And what you can see is that when the yield curve inverts, we almost inevitably get a recession. And we have had a long and deep inversion in the yield curve for a couple of years now. Now, that being said, we're starting to see the yield curve uninvert, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. You can see that sometimes the yield curve uninverts and then we get a recession shortly after the uninversion. So I do think that although the outlook generally looks pretty solid, recession risks are higher than they are normally. So I would put the probability of recession at the U.S. economy over the next 12, 18 months or so at about 30%, and that's higher than the normal probability of about 10%. And we're still dealing with a global economy that is at risk of recession. This comes from my former employer, Moody's Analytics, based in Westchester, just a little bit south of here, off of 202. You can see that much of the global economy is in that yellow at risk of recession category. Just as we have been dealing with high inflation and high interest rates in the U.S., we've seen a similar situation globally, UK, European Central Bank, Bank of Canada, so forth, raising their interest rates. Now, they've started to cut like our Fed has started to cut, but it could be that they're too late and that we'll get recessions in those economies. Now, the U.S. economy can continue to expand even if we have a global recession, but that does make us more vulnerable to a potential downturn in the U.S. And then we've seen a weak recovery in China as well. So China ended its zero COVID policy in early 2023. We were expecting a strong rebound there. That hasn't been the case. We have seen some stimulus measures from China recently. But the Chinese recovery has been disappointing, and we've seen the Chinese and global economies decoupling. So China has been less of a driver of global economic growth over the past couple of years than we were expecting. And then we're still dealing with fallout from the office market. So this is an office property price index. You can see those big declines in office prices. We just have too much office space out there post-pandemic. We're not going in as often. Now, there are some indications that things are stabilizing, but still problems there, and the financial system is still exposed to this. I think banks overall are in pretty good shape and are prepared for problems in the office market, but there are concerns about other types of financing. Many of those loans are going to roll over, and so there is a potential for negative fallout from the office market. But when you put it all together, we expect to see slower economic growth in 2025 as the economy continues to absorb the impact of the higher interest rates that we've seen over the past couple of years, but continued expansion. And then I do expect to see growth start to pick up toward the end of next year as those Federal Reserve interest rate cuts, lower interest rates, work their way through the economy and support a pickup in business borrowing and support a pickup in consumer borrowing. And the unemployment rate, as I mentioned, was 4.1% in September. Maybe it gets up to 4.4, 4.5% second half of next year. Still historically low, still a tight labor market, just not as tight. And then it starts to decline in 2026. And then inflation, I think, is back to the Federal Reserve's 2% objective by the spring of next year. But there is a lot of uncertainty out there. As I mentioned, it's a close recession call. We have uncertainty. Wouldn't it be nice to have a normal election where we know the winner a couple of days after the election? I'm in Pittsburgh, so I know what you're going through with all of the ads on TV and everything. But it would be nice just to have things settled. But if there's uncertainty around the election that persists, perhaps consumers turn nervous, businesses turn nervous, and that causes problems. I'm concerned about geopolitical risks, in particular, the potential for a wider war in the Middle East that would drive up energy prices. That means not only more consumer spending on energy, less on other things, but also higher inflation, and maybe that means the Fed can't cut rates as aggressively. So lots of concerns out there, and I think if I'm wrong with my forecast, I'm more likely to be wrong that the economy is weaker than I'm saying than it is to be stronger than I'm saying. Let's talk a little bit about manufacturing activity in the U.S. and locally. This is two measures from the National Association of Purchasing, they changed the name, Institute of Supply Management, their Purchasing Managers Index. What you can see is that manufacturing activity has been roughly flat for the last couple of years, whether we're looking at overall activity or new orders. Right near that 50 level that indicates neutral conditions. Higher interest rates are a particular drag on manufacturing. When the Fed raises interest rates, they want to cool off manufacturing activity. And so after that initially strong recovery following the pandemic, we've seen the Fed raise rates, and that has been a drag on manufacturing. And pricing power is limited for manufacturers. So the blue line is industrial production for manufacturers. That's essentially industrial output. You can see that that has been flat for the last few years after the recovery. The orange line is what we call the capacity utilization rate. That's the share of their capacity that manufacturers are using. And you can see that that's fallen from about 80% down to about 76%. So there is more spare capacity out there in manufacturing, which means that manufacturers have less pricing power, less ability to increase their prices. This is very interesting. This is manufacturing employment. The U.S. is on the blue line on the left-hand scale. The Delaware Valley area is the orange line on the right-hand scale. You can see that after the initial contraction, that U.S. employment in manufacturing was slightly above its pre-pandemic level and has basically been flat since early 2022. But we have seen a couple of different trends in the Philadelphia area. First of all, manufacturing employment never got back to its pre-pandemic level, in part because the labor market is tighter here than it is in the rest of the country. And then we have seen a drop-off in Philadelphia area manufacturing employment over the past year or so, whereas at the national level it's been stable. And I think part of this is that the Philadelphia area is perhaps more exposed to those higher interest rates. Also, part of it, I think, is just the much tighter labor market that we have here, the fact that the unemployment rate in the Philadelphia area is below the national average, and it's difficult for manufacturers to find workers. Let's talk a little bit about regional economic conditions. This comes from the Philadelphia Fed. This is how things stood in February of 2020, right before the pandemic, looking very good there throughout the country. We would not have had a recession in 2020 were it not for the pandemic. Go forward to May of 2020, not a lot to like there. Every state is in that deep red contraction category. That's different from most recessions in the U.S., where there are one or two pockets of the country that are holding up well. And then this is things as of August of this year. And what you can see is that generally, conditions are a little more mixed. So we do have some weakness, in particular in the industrial heartland, which is a lot of heavy manufacturing, very interest rate sensitive. That overall Pennsylvania, you can see a slight contraction in Delaware, flat conditions in New Jersey, a little bit better in this area than in other parts of the country, perhaps, but more mixed conditions now than we had even 6 months ago. And then finally, this is total employment. I set the February of 2020 before the pandemic equal to 100. What you can see is that job losses in the Philadelphia area were perhaps a little bit larger than what we experienced nationally, in part because there was greater restrictions on economic activity imposed in the Northeast than in other parts of the country. But right now, employment, as I mentioned, nationally about 5% higher than it was before the pandemic. Same story in the Philadelphia area. So good, solid, average recovery here, and that's better than the rest of Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, where I'm from, employment is still lower than it was before the pandemic. We have not fully recovered. Less exposed to the housing cycle. House prices here didn't increase as much during the boom a couple of years ago. And then when we had a housing slowdown in 2023, not as pronounced in the Philadelphia area as it has been in the rest of the country. And then this is the key. This is population growth. You can see that population growth in the Delaware Valley area is well below the national average. And that means it's going to be difficult to recruit workers. That means it's going to be difficult to find consumers for your products. And so the area needs to think about ways to increase population growth. Obviously, you have fantastic colleges and universities here. That could be a source of labor force growth. Immigration could be a source of labor force growth. We need to fix that system. But certainly something to think about over the longer run, because you really need that base of consumers. You need that labor force base to enjoy economic growth over the longer run. You can find all of our materials at pnc.com/economic reports. We put up material, do a U.S. write-up once a month. We put up write-ups on the U.S. data as it comes out. And you can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Gus Faucher, PNC. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.